Well, hello and welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. This is chapter 14 of The Last Battle, Night Falls on Narnia.
I'm not sure if I just want to get this out of the way. I'm not sure if this is the further up and further in. Because I heard two things that were not quite the quote.
You know what? You're right. I thought about this the first time I read it because I think they say, let's go further in and let's go further up or something. Do you have it in front of you?
Well, we both do, but I don't
No, I know. I have it right here.
Not on that page.
Come further in, right. Come further up.
I thought, come on. People are misquoting it. No.
You're like, yeah, everyone's saying it wrong.
But then I did get a sneak. I looked at the table of contents and I saw there's a chapter.
The next chapter is called Further Up. And further in. But yes, I did come across that. I was like, oh, it feels kind of he's going to hear it, but for all of the emails that we have gotten that are signed Further Up and Further In, it'd be weird if it was just this one reference that people's like, oh, that's kind of a throwaway line at this point. Still.
If you wanted to, quote something from the book, maybe quote Malgrim when he signs a letter.
That
actually makes sense.
Well, here we are. We only have 3 chapters to go in this entire series. And it's in this very chapter, Phil, that you have now seen Narnia be destroyed. You just kill a bug on my dining room table.
With my copy of The Last Battle. Actually, this is my wife's copy. So.
Okay. I was going to say, it's a nice metaphor if you want to scrape that little bug off the place where... That's actually my son's spot on the table, too, so we'll need to Clorox wipe that. But the great metaphor here, using the last battle to end the life. We've never had death on the show before, but a bug literally just died. A tiny little mosquito, it looked like.
I feel like Obama. You remember when he killed a fly on air?
Wow, how would I remember? No, I have zero memory of this.
You're really into memes and stuff.
No, I don't remember him ever killing a bug.
He was just in an interview and he notices a fly and grabs it out of the air on the first try. It's so good.
Have I ever told you about? I won't do it now. But the pastor who married us killed a giant bumblebee, and we had an inside wedding in the middle of his homily for our wedding.
Wow.
Yeah. I'll tell the story another time.
Why did he kill a bumblebee?
It was flying into and getting caught in Anna's veil, and it was like the biggest bee we'd ever seen. And his homily was actually about love and death, and so it was very much divine providence. He had to stomp on this giant bee that kept trying to fly into Anna's veil, and even to this day. Some people are like, I remember your wedding just for the bee alone. I'm like, I'm glad that's the only thing you remember. But okay, that's fine. I guess I said I wasn't going to tell the story, and then I did. So there you go. Well, Phil, there's so much to get to with this chapter. There's very, very little dialogue in this entire thing. As I finished the chapter, I went back and looked, and I was wondering, this might be the least amount of talking in any chapter in the entire Chronicles.
Yeah.
Aslan has a line at the very beginning of the chapter where he simply says, yes, while he lay dreaming, his name was Time. Now that he is awake, he will have a new one. Speaking of Father Time. And then there's a little bit of talking at the end as the 7 friends of Narnia make it through the door that Aslan has, and they do meet Emeth, who I will say, when it comes to the discussion of Emeth, this Calorman who somehow appears in Aslan's country, I know there's a lot of discussion to be had about what exactly is going on, but we're going to table that for next chapter. So if anyone's waiting for that discussion, he still appears in the next chapter, and I think when we see his whole story, that's the best place to talk about what exactly Lewis is doing here by including this Calorman soldier, right, who believed in Tash all of his life here in Aslan's country. So let's just wait and do that in our next episode.
Okay. I do have a clarifying question.
Sure.
I may have misunderstood, but I thought they closed the door and then Aslan bounds away and they follow him walking away from the door. Did I miss that?
No, they go through it.
So they go through it and then he locks it?
Yes, they lock it from the inside almost, or maybe the outside. We'll figure that out maybe more in the next chapter.
Right. I'm having enough trouble understanding how this door works.
No, that's fine. They go through the door. Everything freezes. Peter pulls the door shut, locks it, but they go through it, right? And so
they went through the door to get in there.
And then through
the door
to get out as well too. And so, yes, that is true. Narnia is destroyed. In this chapter, Narnia has ceased to exist. We're going to get into all the things that happen, but at the very end of this chapter, it's completely covered by a giant flood, kind of straight out of Genesis 6, and Narnia freezes over. The ice creeps all the way up to the door itself, and then they close it, and that's the very end of the world that we've come to love for the last 7 books.
Not a lot of room to reopen it and write a few more books later.
Not at all. Yeah, there's no reboot coming in the future, thankfully.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. Fingers crossed. Well, let's dive into chapter 14 here, Phil. You have the summary, so take it away whenever you're ready.
The kings and queens of Narnia stand beside Aslan as he roars, waking Father Time and draining the sky of shooting stars. Enormous animals crawl and slide into Narnia, and soon thousands of smaller beasts appear too and run towards the doorway. As these creatures approach, some cease to be talking beasts and disappear into the nothingness behind the lion. Others go through the doorway. The monsters and land of Narnia continue to die and shrivel up. A stillness settles in, and a wall of water comes and covers everything. The sun is squeezed out, and at Aslan's command, Peter shuts the door, locking it with a key. The lion bounds away, calling for everyone to follow him. As they walk in his direction, the dogs alert the small crowd of the presence of a Glormine. Surprised, the others approach him and are greeted by Emeth, whom they ask to share a story.
All right. Oh man, I'm so glad I didn't have to write the summary to this, because it seems impossible, maybe even of all the chapters we've ever been through, and there's been a lot at this point. I don't know how many episodes we're in here, but 100 some, obviously, at this point.
Enough for syndication.
That's right. Of all of these chapters that we have done, it's hard to imagine one that is harder to put into words, because what's really on display here is the ironic, in many ways, the beauty of Lewis's prose throughout this entire chapter. You know, we see Narnia come to an end, this world that we've all grown to love for 7 books, right? And the way it's destroyed is so magical in a way. And the thing that struck me the most as I was reading it for the first time, maybe about a week ago or so, and then as I revisited it throughout this week, was just how weirdly melancholy it made me feel. But I just felt, melancholy is not even a great word, because I had so many different feelings. I feel sad, but I'm also, there's a joy there. And that I don't think the joy has anything to do with the end of Narnia, but I recall, obviously, Aslan's creation that we just discussed last season, his creation of Narnia, the magician's nephew. And there are so many similarities. And with both of them, it's just so clear how in control Aslan is and how everything is just completely subservient to him. And I wonder for myself as I'm reading this and just, giving my initial reactions here, if the beauty that's found in it is the fact that everything just bows to Aslan's will at this point.
Even those that don't like him. This is the end of all the stuff. It's the end of everything.
It's, Aslan
for this group.
Yeah, Aslan will have his way. And there's just, I don't know, I find comfort in that. My wife said it's because I'm a 6 on the Enneagram, but... Allegedly. I told her I was a Libra, but she didn't really care. Tell me, what are you thinking? You've never read this before, and you're reading about the destruction of Narnia. And then we'll obviously go through our walkthrough, but I do want to hear just your initial thoughts here.
Hearing you say this, I'm wondering if this is part of why it was so hard for me to read this chapter. It was physically difficult to focus on this chapter, which is something that I don't usually struggle with. I usually struggle to sit down to read, but then once I am 2 pages in, it's pretty easy to stay focused on that. And man, I just really had a hard time with this one. And I think part of it could be that I don't want Narnia to go away. And this is the first time I'm reading this, the first time I'm experiencing this happening. I think the other piece is that I really enjoy dialogue. I think that's how I learn the best is hearing people talk or reading a transcript of people talk. I love reading scripts, and I think I process things very well that way.
This is true. You don't usually watch movies. You just listen, or you just read the script. Like, I've done it. I'm fine.
I have done that for several movies. It's kind of fun.
Okay.
You get to visualize it in your head.
Before you've watched the movie, you've just read the script?
Yeah, I have not seen Lethal Weapon, but I've read the script.
Lethal Weapon? Why did, like, an action movie is what you chose as, I'm not going to watch the movie?
People kept referencing it as this great example screenplay. I think maybe because the person who wrote it kind of went from 0 to 100 in terms of their career because it was their first script. I don't know if that's true.
I've never
That's
seen
just
it.
my guess.
Or read it.
Yeah. I also read the novelization of The Dark Knight because when The Dark Knight came out, I was in Yellowstone.
So you read the book?
So I read the novelization that I bought at this little gas station type store.
Okay.
And
they don't have movie theaters in
then
Wyoming, is what you're saying.
They don't. There is nothing.
I have been to the movies in Wyoming, in Jackson.
Yeah.
So I know they at least have one movie theater.
Yeah, but there is no way we were going.
Yeah, not in Yellowstone. Yeah, you're too far north at that point.
I think it took and it literally is the script with a few descriptors, so it maybe took 2-3 hours to read. About the time to see a movie.
Okay.
But it was fun to go see the movie because I knew all the lines. The lines were exactly the same.
You're like, all right, got it.
I think that this was really hard to read. It was like you're saying, very beautiful. And I think that if it has to end, of course, this is the way that makes the most sense. I'm glad that I got to see it created recently in a previous book. Mm-hmm. But I think I'm glad that those were so close together because this would have been really hard.
Yeah.
To watch. All the creatures are gone, and then the world itself the grass is gone. Everything's stripped of any sense of life, and then flooded, and then just left.
And when I see that, I have a sense of joy. I don't know that joy's the right word. I mean, maybe it is kind of Sehnsucht. Maybe that's really what it is, because I think the overwhelming feeling for myself is one of melancholy, this very pensive sadness, right? It's a sadness, but it's a thoughtful sadness as to all that's happening. And I think that's what Lewis, I think, wants us to feel. I wonder if that's what the Seven Friends of Narnia are feeling. We don't really hear a lot about what's happening in Diggory and Polly's heads. They're there for the creation of Narnia. Mm-hmm. And then 60-ish years later, for them, they're now here for its destruction. And we'll get there in a moment. We do hear a little bit from them. In fact, Diggory says, "I saw it begin. I did not think I would live to see it die." I don't see it here. I don't believe Polly has a line, although I think Lewis, as the narrator, does say something along the lines at some point that they kind of recognized the sun when they see the sun dying because they had seen this in Charn already. But outside of that, we don't really hear much about what's happening to them. Yeah, Lewis says, the Lord Diggory and the Lady Polly looked at one another and gave a little nod. Those two in a different world had once seen a dying sun. I wonder for them if it is this kind of thoughtful sadness, thinking about all of it, because there is a sadness, but it isn't inherently a catastrophe or tragic, because you're right there next to Aslan, who at this point is completely in control, and whatever is happening is what Aslan wants to happen. We are not in this problem of pain where things are happening because of free will between the talking beast or between the Narnians or even humans. Everything happening right now is completely bowing to the will of Aslan. So the sadness there is maybe the grief for the animals who are being judged and walking away, seemingly going to their damnation, right? Lewis doesn't use that word, and maybe we'll feel differently, but that's at least the way that I read it. There's just so much to get in there. Let's just jump into this chapter before we spend too much time looking at the big picture here. Let's really get into the weeds. So we mentioned this last time when we had Andrew on. Aslan ends chapter 13 saying, "Time, time," and the door flew open. I told you we would be seeing a character we haven't seen in a long time. Did you expect Father Time to come like breaking forth through the earth?
I didn't, but what a way to plan ahead and plant that seed as they're going all those levels down and they see him. It's just enough to make it all feel connected.
I actually want to revisit the silver chair, not just now, but later as well. I came across some of our old notes, but here's exactly what Lewis writes in, I believe it's chapter maybe 13 chapter 10, Travels Without the Sun in the Silver Chair. And this is what the warden says. He says, "That is old Father Time, who was once a king in Overland. And now he has sunk down into the deep realm and lies dreaming of all the things that are done in the upper world. Many sink down and few return to the sunlit lands. They say he will wake at the end of the world." And Lewis just straight up told us when we were reading the book exactly when we would see him again.
I just didn't know that we would see the
That's true. You didn't know that we necessarily would
see.
That
was even more masterfully done than I remembered.
Yeah.
Well.
So Father Time does come up, right? He blows a horn and the stars stop falling. But I want to talk a little bit about...
That has to be a cool sound, right? It can't be like a funny high pitch.
Yeah, it's not. It doesn't
like
sound... What were those... remember back during the World Cup in South Africa? What was...
Vuvuzelas?
Yeah. That does not sound like that. Yeah. I feel like it probably doesn't. I went to The Discarded Image, one of Lewis's academic works, because I had remembered, and I probably read this in Planet Narnia for the first time, but at some point came across the connection that exists between Father Time and Saturn. Now, throughout this season, we have talked about how Michael Ward, the author of Planet Narnia and of the Narnian Code, part of his thesis is that this book represents Saturn, the seventh of the medieval heavens. But I actually want to read from Lewis's words. In The Discarded Image, this is what he has to say about Saturn, the seventh planet. The seventh planet in the medieval world.
Okay.
You looked at me very funny, like, "Hey, buddy, I don't think that one's right."
Got ourselves a Pluto situation over here.
All right, here's what Lewis writes in the early 1960s. He says, "In the earth, his," meaning Saturn, "influence produces lead. In men, the melancholy complexion. In history, disastrous events. In Dante, his sphere is the heaven of contemplatives. He is connected with sickness and old age. Our traditional picture of Father Time with the scythe is derived from early pictures of Saturn. A good account of his activities in promoting fatal accidents, pestilence, treacheries, and ill luck in general occurs in The Knight's Tale," this medieval work, not the movie.
With Heath Ledger.
Yeah, not the movie. "He is the most terrible of the seven and is sometimes called the greater in fortune, in Fortuna Major." Now, let's actually just hold that, because in a chapter or two, we're going to go back to Fortuna Major, which is Jupiter himself.
And he assisted Jabba the Hutt, correct?
Please stop. That's Bib Fortuna, okay?
I want to give a special shout out to the person who really enjoys our show, except for the Star Wars stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And is driving right now, and they almost pull over just to calm down. We were doing so well, we made it 20 minutes in, and then why do they always do that? Because we listen to the show before we release it, and
sure.
it cracks me up every time. I'm like, dude, focus.
Yeah, like
it's always me. I'm always
on target. Stay on target. All right. Well, let's go back to this quote by Lewis here. And I wanted to mention too, I thought something that was interesting. Lewis makes a connection to Dante, obviously one of his favorite authors. It's in this 22nd canto of Paradiso, the third part of the Divine Comedy, where Dante depicts different founders of religious orders and monks in this kind of Saturn-like, in this Saturn heaven of paradise. It's where we actually very famously see Saint Benedict. And so there's this idea of Saturn, right? Thinking about this in the sense of each of these books lining up with the medieval heaven, but also in the sense of Father Time, who is directly connected to Saturn, is an actual literal character in this book. And there's this, I'm just interested in the connection he makes to Dante. And again, when Lewis is writing The Discarded Image, he's not writing about Narnia per se at all. But the connection to Dante is interesting because of the contemplative nature that Dante gives to Saturn. I mean, when you think of St. Benedict, you think of these founders of different religious orders and monks. You do think of a contemplative faith, right? So interesting that Lewis picks up on that. I think that's going to come up in another chapter too. So just kind of hold that loosely. What I also found very interesting is that Michael Ward noted that in an earlier draft he had come across for the silver chair, Lewis straight up in that chapter, chapter 10, calls Father Time Saturn. The warden says his name is Saturn and he'll rise at the end of the world. He just calls him Saturn.
Yeah.
Right? He doesn't even try to hide it. And then at some point in a later draft, Lewis went back and did change his name to Father Time. Now, outside of Ward's own writing, I was not super familiar. I maybe had heard a connection about this, but I don't remember where I heard it from, about Father Time and Saturn being related. And the reason this would have been especially familiar to Lewis was because the current imagery that you and I have of Father Time actually became popularized during the Renaissance. You know, in antiquity, we see the Greek god Chronos, but that's Chronos, like where we get the word chronology from, right? And then there's also the Greek Titan, Kronos, who's the one who eats his children. That's Zeus's dad, right? Who then Zeus feeds the rock to, he doesn't feed the rock. We're not going to get into all the Greek mythology, but one of the things that's interesting is that Zeus's father, Kronos, the Titan, carried a scythe, while the Greek god Kronos was the god of time. And the invention of Father Time kind of came about as these two, we don't exactly know, but it seems like these two gods kind of morphed into each other. And it happened specifically during the Renaissance, probably not long after all of the prominent death imagery, the dance macabre, right? My French is not great, so forgive me, right? Comes into play often with kind of the rise of the bubonic plague. Yeah. So Lewis would have been wildly familiar. That's a weird adverb there, but whatever, go with it. He would have been just very, very familiar with this. I find it interesting, though, that Lewis has the characters. Edmund says something later on, and we'll just get to it now because we're talking about Father Time. But he says that he will now have a new name. Isn't that interesting here?
It is, but they never said what the new name is, at least in this chapter.
No, they don't, and they never will. It's actually, I thought it was later on, but it's here in the very first paragraph. It says, "Then Jill and Eustace remembered how once long ago, in the deep caves beneath those moors, they had seen a great giant asleep, and been told that his name was Father Time, and that he would wake on the day the world ended. Yes, said Aslan, though they had not spoken. And while he lay dreaming, his name was Time. Now that he is awake, he will have a new one."
Doth Vader.
What do you think his new name is?
I have no idea. I love the description of there are all these stars, and there is an absence of stars in the shape of a man, the biggest giant they've ever seen.
Yeah. Great imagery.
It's probably Cronus or Saturn.
Well, no. I don't believe it's either of those.
Really? Why not?
Because Michael Ward told me it wasn't. And not him. He didn't actually tell me this. I read it in his book. Yeah. We'll get to that in the very last chapter. I think that Lewis makes it quite clear what his name is. If you're reading Dr. Ward's work, he's done a great job being able to...
Is it Time?
...paint a picture. No, he said his name was Time, and now he will have a new one.
Oh.
Yes. But let's dive in. So now we have a little background with Father Time, and unfortunately we'll just have to hold on to that until a chapter or two from now. Let's talk about these stars falling from the sky, because we're going to go back from the silver chair references all the way back to the Voyage of the Dawn Treader now.
Right. I love the descriptions of the shooting stars. Once they land, things do burn when they land, but they are people.
Yes.
And he said he connects it to our world where they're just flaming balls of gas.
Flaming balls of gas, right?
Yes. But he admits that and then says in this world it's different in a very smooth way.
So we even are reminded that Edmund and Lucy had once met one. It's interesting that Lewis doesn't say Eustace, because Eustace also met Ramandu there in Dawn Treader. He was the one who even said, stars are just a flaming ball of gas, and
right.
Ramandu reminds him, no, that's even in your world, they're not just that. Yeah. Exactly. And
I just want to say that every time you say Eustace, I want to say useless.
Oh,
and I only have a few more chances, so I had to say it there.
That's fine. What was the name of that character? Why am I totally blanking on the owl's name?
Who?
No. What was the name of the owl? People are yelling at their iPods right now. If they still have one.
Also, how did you get this show on your iPod?
I assume that you can go to Apple Podcasts. What?
What was that owl's name?
Well, it showed up in, Glimfeather? Is that right?
That sounds close.
I want to say that it's yes, Glimfeather. It is. I just looked it up. It is Glimfeather. Again, we are just still mostly novices here, everybody. Let's talk more about, so the stars come down and the shape grows in the sky, but the shape that's actually growing in the sky is really just the absence of all of those stars.
Right.
And then
it was not a cloud at all. It was simply emptiness.
It was simply emptiness.
And the stars were falling. Aslan had called them home. That's very powerful phrasing.
And from there, after he calls them home, we see the actual destruction of Narnia begin. What happens here?
So all the people are around. They have long hair. They're glittering.
And we see these dragons and lizards appear.
And then, this destruction of the creatures go out. And it seems like they go out and start destroying things. And all the creatures come out of where those enormous creatures went. So they kind of go out into the space, and then all the creatures come in because it's time to go. You can't stay. A lizard's destroying everything.
And it doesn't say exactly where they come from, although it does say the light from behind them was so strong that it lit up even the slopes of the northern moors. Now, here it's talking about the stars, and then it says something was moving there, enormous animals. So this is on the northern part, and the animals are dragons and lizards. I actually went back and copy and pasted into this episode's notes some of my notes from chapter 14 in Silverchair when we learned about the land of Bism. Remember Bism, right? And there in Bism, Lewis talked a little bit about salamanders and kind of other fire-related animals. And one of the things that I had done a little bit of research on and had learned about was that salamanders were mentioned by both Pliny the Elder and by St. Augustine as being associated with fire and folklore. And obviously, often we associate fire with destruction. I'm pretty sure I even quoted this, but Leonardo da Vinci writes in the 15th century, they have no digestive organs and get no food but from the fire, in which it constantly renews its scales, speaking of salamanders. And so I believe that these dragons, these giant lizards, are assumingly coming up from Bism to then destroy the world. It might not be the case, but it makes sense to me. They're coming from the north. Lewis had put that back. We also know he had finished Last Battle when he's still working on, or at least around the time of the Silver Chair. So it's not like he can go, oh yeah, I did mention that, let's bring it back. I mean, he's working on these manuscripts at a similar time. Yeah. And so it seems like, again, Lewis in that underworld was planning those things. So a lot of the destruction itself is coming from below, which is an interesting thing.
Father Time was below, right? Mm-hmm. Was he in Bism, or was he right before they got to Bism?
No, he would have been actually before they even got to the city in the underworld, because they see him while they're traveling. Yeah, I think it's even before they go across that big underwater sea.
Okay. I'm also curious about the featherless birds with wings like bat wings. Curious what the size is there. It definitely makes me think of dinosaurs.
They've got to be
is that
big,
what you're
right?
Getting?
They have to be big. They're destroying everything.
Right. And you got to be efficient about that kind of work. that's listed separately than great dragons. When I think featherless bird with wings like bat wings, I think of a dragon. But then if dragons are being mentioned before, it makes me think of dinosaurs.
Yeah. So all this is happening, and from this we see all of the talking beast approach where Aslan is. And I'm actually going to read a paragraph or so from this. The creatures came rushing on, their eyes brighter and brighter as they drew nearer and nearer to the standing stars. But as they came right up to Aslan, one or other of two things happened to each of them. They all looked straight in his face. I don't think they had a choice about that. And when some looked, the expression of their faces changed terribly. It was fear and hatred. Except that, on the faces of talking beasts, the fear and hatred lasted only for a fraction of a second. You could see that they suddenly ceased to be talking beasts. They were just ordinary animals. And all the creatures who looked at Aslan in that way swerved to the right, his left, and disappeared into his huge black shadow, which, as you have heard, streamed away to the left of the doorway. The children never saw them again. I don't know what became of them. But the others looked in the face of Aslan and loved him, though some of them were very frightened at the same time. And all these came in at the door, which is capitalized here, in on Aslan's right. There were some queer specimens among them. Eustace even recognized one of those very dwarfs who had helped to shoot the horses. But he had no time to wonder about that sort of thing, and anyway, it was no business of his, for a great joy put everything else out of his head. Among the happy creatures who now came crowding round Tyrion and his friends were all those whom they had thought dead. There was Runewit the centaur, and Jewel the unicorn, and the good boar, and the good bear, and Farsight the eagle, and the dear dogs, and the horses, and Poggin the dwarf. And then Runewit yells further in and higher up. So not quite. He didn't get the memo.
So I'm going to send me.
It's not our hashtag right
weeks.
now, Runewit, you know. So we also hear at the door itself, like right before what I just read, Lewis says, unless either the door had grown very much larger or the creatures had all grown smaller, they all began to enter through it. And we see this in Baines' illustration. The door is significantly larger than the illustration we even saw in just the last chapter.
Or the creatures are smaller. But probably the door grew.
Hey, who knows? So we have here what appears to be the final judgment. Tell me a little bit about this as you're reading it.
This definitely matches up with some of the imagery I remember from, I guess, books based on one possible way that Revelation could be carried out. Mm-hmm. And I'm specifically thinking of the Left Behind series.
I've never read it.
I read one or maybe three or four of the series for kids.
Okay.
Or
Left Behind
for younger people. The kids.
I know dish. I had one, or at least got one for. I don't know if I ever read it though.
I think I read at least one or two of the larger ones, and I think anything along those lines is difficult because it comes across as this is how it's going to happen, mm-hmm. even though it was presented to me as this is a way that it could happen. And I actually, my dad sat down and discussed the different ways that Revelation could be interpreted. And we don't really know some of the stuff, but this is very similar to how I pictured it. And it was the hardest.
Okay.
Well,
Left Behind was. You're a dispensational premillennial?
No. The stuff that would come after the Left Behind stuff.
Oh, okay.
Specifically when you read Revelation, just the way that information is presented, this seems like it would match up in terms of Aslan being, the Christ figure mm-hmm. in this supposal. And just the way that everybody understands who's in charge. But I think the hardest part for me was the fact that there is no recognition or last minute changing of hearts and minds. Some creatures had that look of fear and hatred, and then they disappear. And the narrator here says that he doesn't know what happened to them. That part was hard to, and it matches up with, what could be the situation for us too. But man, I want so much for everyone to know the Lord and the joy that comes with that.
Sure.
And it's hard to read this as someone who, I have a lot of friends who I really want them to have the joy of knowing God. So,
I love so much, and I want to respond more to what you have to say, but I want to save it for the next chapter because I think there's more of this discussion. So please don't think that I don't care. But I think that as we get to talking to Emeth in the next chapter, I think Lewis has a little bit more to say to us here. I think in this moment, we see this image of judgment. And I mean, you mentioned Left Behind, and I cannot say I'm a very big fan of them. I mean, I know the story decently enough, but I think, with the Left Behind books, which take this, premillennial dispensationalist approach to the end times, which is a very, very,
you should define that.
All I'll say is this, because I don't want to get into all the theology of it, of eschatology, is simply the view they have of the end times with the rapture and all of the tribulation stuff is a minority view among Christians, not just right now across the world, but also throughout all of Christian history. Yeah. And what's, I think, really frustrating is that I think a lot of us, those books and the movies and stuff, they have a tendency to sit in our cultural imagination stronger than stuff that's actually, that has been the church's teaching, or even Protestant teaching for those of us in the Protestant tradition for a long time. So I'm not going to wade into too much of that controversy, but the point is they take a very specific approach in those books, whereas Lewis really doesn't take much of an approach to how the world ends. And in fact, I would argue he is really not playing into much of what happens in the book of Revelation here, but instead is going back to the Gospel of St. Matthew. Instead, I wanted to read a little bit from this because I do think there are some allusions to Revelation, but I think for the most part, Lewis kind of steer clears of that. And not because it's not important. The book of Revelation is part of the Bible. It's divinely important. It's of the utmost importance, but Lewis, as we know, was always focused on this mere Christianity, and he was not someone that was going to wade into different views of eschatology. We see maybe a little bit more in some of his letters or in letters to Malcolm or even his Latin letters too. But in his more mainstream writing, he just steers clear of this stuff. And I'm thankful that he does because there's an image depicted here, but not a theological stance taken.
Right.
I did want to go now, though, to Matthew 25, and if you will permit me, it's in public domain, so we're okay. I'm going to read about 16 verses from Matthew, if you will allow me. And if you say no, you're saying no to the Bible, so...
I could do 12.
All right,
Just don't tell me.
I won't tell you. We're going to start at Matthew. This is 25 verses 32 through some other verse that I'm not going to say to Phil. And this is Jesus himself talking. And I think for listeners who maybe are not as familiar with the Bible,
these letters are red.
Oh, yeah. These are the letters that are read in some of your versions, right? And that's R-E-D, read. I mean, they also should be R-E-A-D, read, but the joke that Phil was making is that it's read because Jesus is talking. And I want to read this because, our listeners come from a variety of backgrounds. And I know we have many listeners that are not religious at all. And I think some of what a listener might, or a reader might, if you're not familiar with the Bible, might read this and go, oh, it's very much related to Revelation. I think really it's actually related to something that Jesus says about the end times, not something that maybe St. John writes himself. So here's Matthew 25, starting at verse 32. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me.' Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did you see a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?' The king will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.' And then he will say to those on his left, 'Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me.' They also will answer, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or needing clothes, or sick, or in prison, and did not help you?' And he will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me.' Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life." I mean, Lewis even has them on the right and the left too, right? Yeah. I mean, he at this point, Lewis is kind of at the very end of Dawn Treader. Lewis is allowing that supposal to maybe fade away quite a bit here and just have what almost, dare I say it, is an allegory, you know?
Right here at the end. Yeah, I feel like he's doing his classic Lewis thing where he has a structure and he's pulling from different parts of the Bible at the same time. Mm-hmm. And then he also is folding in different mythologies into that as well. But I think the main things from Revelation are we have the sound of a horn.
Oh, yeah, it's true.
And I think a lot of we don't have a ton of the number 7. We don't have any trimming of wicks.
There's 7 friends.
Well, that's been, yeah.
I mean, sure. But
we don't have stars falling in groups of 7, okay. Or there aren't as many crowns, at least yet. But I feel like the main thing is the stars and the falling stars, and then the horn sound.
So as we have this judgment, what do you make of the fact that Eustace notices one of the dwarfs who was literally murdering the horses who knows what time is at this point, but for us, just a few chapters ago, one of the dwarfs who we can only assume saw Puzzle, that Puzzle was this fake Aslan, right? And said, well, I don't really care, and followed the rest of the dwarves and said the dwarves are for the dwarves. And all of a sudden we now have one of them entering into, again, if I'm allowed to say it, heaven, right?
In the same way that we had this group that was on the wrong side and had that look of fear and hatred for just a split second and then disappears. As sad as that made me, this particular part gave me so much hope because you don't know what's going on in someone's head. You don't know what's going on in their heart, and you don't know their story. And you don't know what's going to happen after you interact with him.
Sure.
It just gives me so much hope because that was such a recent thing. The killing of the horses was
it wasn't like you messed up a lot when you were a teenager, but you've learned from this. Like, now you were murdering people the day that you died.
Yes, but also clutch move because Narnia is over now.
Yeah. I love this aside from Lewis here, and even this is like, anyway, it's no business of his,
Right. Similar to that's not your story.
It's not your story to be told, right?
But we will later get into this story. So I'm glad that we get some stories.
Yeah, I think with this dwarf, but for Emeth, what we have seen so far of him is that he still is rather virtuous. Going back to Dante, he's one of those virtuous pagans, potentially, right? That you see kind of in limbo at the very beginning of the Inferno. But with this dwarf, I mean, he was like directly in rebellion. He was fighting against the people on Aslan's side. And I wonder for this particular dwarf, if we don't get a name for him, if he's the kind of person who lacked the courage that Poggin had, but in his heart, in his mind, knew that what he was doing was wrong, and was able at some point to find that opportunity for confession, for forgiveness, to change, his posture, his behavior. Because we know that there's a lot of the dwarves who we just saw last chapter who are, they refuse to be taken in. They are very much not a part of this crowd that's going to be welcomed into Aslan's country here. But it does give me hope. This beautiful, simple little sentence here. This dwarf who was on the wrong side, who was doing the wrong things, who gets to enter into eternal glory here. And we don't know his entire story, but it says something so great about Aslan himself that he does know, right? That same level of hope where you and I had kind of, or at least me, I'd condemned all the dwarfs, right? Literally, to hell with them, right? Mm-hmm. And we feel like that about a lot of people, I'm sure. I'm so glad that God doesn't say that to us, right? That God has that same level, that same posture of forgiveness to all of us. Because I wonder if this is what he's saying by having Eustace be the one that points it out. Because Eustace is, he's not been the most perfect person, right? And
I think that each of the 7 friends of Narnia who's there, they all have done stuff that is not okay. Mm-hmm. And they all have a story of redemption in some form. It doesn't hit quite the same if Peter's the one who notices.
Yeah.
It would with Edmund or Eustace, but I think it's incredibly beautiful because Eustace was so strongly opposed to being a decent person. Mm-hmm. And then also this fits his character that he would notice these kind of things. And we already saw Edmund pass it on when he helped Eustace.
And I think with Eustace, he might have a tendency to do what at least I do, which is think of himself as better, right? I'm more holy, I'm more righteous, which, God has a lot to say about people who think that about themselves. And I'm unfortunately guilty of it from time to time. And, Eustace might be thinking, well, how is he here? And then the reminder might be for Eustace is Lucy might be looking at Eustace and be like, how is he here, right?
And even Tyrion and Jewel, they just committed murder at the beginning of the book. And I think what's encouraging is everybody has a different timeline, mm-hmm. but there's still this hope and redemption.
Which is the hope that we also have eventually for Susan. We talked a few episodes ago about Susan. And I'm eager to see maybe some emails and voicemails come in over the next few weeks after we release that episode, because this is why I have hope for Susan. I don't think her story is over. My own headcanon here, if I'm allowed to use that phrase, would be that she absolutely makes it to Narnia in the end. That I have hope that she also is in the midst of this maybe darker season where she's more distant from Aslan, more distant from God, but that there's obviously hope later on that she would return to the faith of her youth. Yeah. Let's keep moving on though. So all of these animals show up. We then see those dragons and lizards. They actually start destroying the world, right? We see it happen. The grass dies. Everything begins to be laid bare. And Lewis has some really beautiful paragraphs. We can't read all of them, unfortunately. But, many of our listeners, I know they just listen with us. They don't necessarily read right along with us. But this might be a chapter for our listeners who don't follow along one chapter at a time. Go back and read this chapter. I'd recommend, because it's so hard for us to put even into this conversation just the depth of the prose that Lewis is working with. I think this might be one of his best moments in all of the Chronicles here. I do want to actually, though, read, after all of this destruction, we then get a wave that comes, a giant wave comes upon, the mountains turn into islands, and then those islands even disappear, and the water even comes to the threshold of the doorway, and it even splashes onto Aslan's paws themselves. And then Lewis writes this. And out there it began to grow light. A streak of dreary and disastrous dawn spread along the horizon and widened and grew brighter, till in the end they hardly noticed the light of the stars who stood behind them. At last the sun came up, and when it did, the Lord Diggory and the Lady Polly looked at one another and gave a little nod. Those two, in a different world, had once seen a dying sun, and so they knew at once that this sun also was dying. It was 3 times, 20 times, as big as it ought to be, and very dark red. As its rays fell upon the great Time Giant. I guess that's his name now. Maybe that's his new name, right? Time Giant.
Time Giant.
All right, I'm taking us out of Lewis's work here. I'll get us back. And as its rays fell upon the great Time Giant, he turned red too. And in the reflection of that sun, the whole waste of shoreless waters looked like blood. And then the moon came up, quite in her wrong position, very close to the sun, and she also looked red. And at the sight of her, the sun began shooting out great flames, like whiskers or snakes of crimson fire, toward her. It is as if he were an octopus trying to draw her to himself in his tentacles, and perhaps he did draw her. At any rate, she came to him, slowly at first, but then more and more quickly, till at last his long flames licked round her, and the two ran together and became one huge ball like a burning coal. Great lumps of fire came dropping out of it into the sea, and clouds of steam rose up. Then Aslan said, "Now make an end." The giant threw his horn into the sea. Then he stretched out one arm, very black it looked, and thousands of miles long, across the sky till his hand reached the sun. He took the sun, and he squeezed it in his hand as you would squeeze an orange, and instantly there was total darkness. Everyone, except Aslan, jumped back from the ice-cold air which now blew through the doorway. Its edges were already covered with icicles. Those are the final moments of Narnia.
Literally there until they turn the lights out on their way out. It's such a good scene.
There's not really much commentary to offer here except just letting the prose, letting the imagery, all of that just kind of fall into our imagination and experience the images that Lewis shares with us. Right after that, Aslan tells Peter to shut the door. And that's when Aslan gives the invitation to come further up or come further in, and then to come further up. Now,
it's nice seeing this catchphrase workshop throughout the chapter.
Yeah, Lewis is
Eventually
testing
they'll
that,
get
trying
it.
to figure out. So obviously there's some pretty clear allusions to Genesis 6 and the flood that occurred at the very beginning of the Bible and this flood that we now see here at the end of Narnia. There's also the scene of Peter being given the key, right, to the door. Were you surprised? I mean, Aslan's more than capable of shutting the door himself. He did just destroy the entire world. Yep. Why do you think it happens to Peter?
Here's my theory. I think that we're watching the story of creation in reverse. So we had someone go in and literally make the doorway, right? And the portal or whatever you're gonna think of it as was there, but then man, like the wardrobe was made by a man out of a tree. So I think we're seeing all the events roughly in reverse. So the creatures were added, and the creatures are pulled back out. The creatures were the last thing to be added to the land, and then they were pulled out.
Oh, interesting! I love this.
And then Peter closes the door. That the humans were there first, and they watched Narnia be made as Aslan growled it into existence.
Yeah.
It also has some.
He sung it. He didn't growl it into existence. Dude, I guess you don't like his singing voice, obviously.
Agree to disagree. I think it also mimics the order we see things in Genesis, where first there is nothing, and then there's land and water separated, and then there's
light and dark,
and then there's light and dark.
Right.
So then we have the water flood everything and cover up the land, and then you have the light be extinguished, and then now there's nothing, and so that door closing is that final piece.
That.
So it's not an exact reverse order, but all the things are getting tied up in there.
It happened. There's a sequence to it.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen in one exact second, right? There's a sequence to the way that God creates the world, and even the way that Aslan created the world. And there's a sequence to the way that we close the world.
Right. And I love that he leaves the lights on so you can see all the cool stuff, and then it extinguishes that in about the most dramatic way you could do it.
Yeah, and it makes sense because we know if we there's a lot of metaphors we use about Jesus and light. I mean, literally right behind you is a little thing my son made in Sunday school hanging on the fridge that says, Jesus shines in my heart, right? And it's a little candle and everything. And because we use the idea of light and shining as something it's right there. It's the giant heart on the thing.
No, I see it. I'm confused by the jellyfish magnet that you put on top of it.
That's just a J. It's the letter J that's also the shape of a jelly. All of the magnets are different letters, but they're also animals.
Okay.
I just happened to pick up the J. There's no deeper meaning to it there. Don't read too much into it. I know that you're in that mode because that's how we treat this book sometimes.
We are primed for it.
On top of that, if we go back to Matthew, and I think this might be maybe helpful for some of our listeners who are not as familiar, maybe even if you are familiar with the story of the Bible, very famously, right, we have St. Peter. We have a Peter in the Bible, right, who is one of Christ's disciples. And I'll read a little bit from Matthew 16 here. This is much shorter. This is just 5 verses. Don't worry, Phil. We won't get a call from the church.
From God.
Yeah, from God saying, hey, I think he'll be okay if we read it on air. But this
Pope online too.
Yeah, this is a conversation between Jesus and between Simon Peter. This is in Matthew chapter 16. This is verses 13 through 19. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" And he's talking about himself right here. They replied, "Well, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by the Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven."
So Peter had the keys.
So there in the Gospel of Matthew, Peter is literally given the keys to heaven, and here in the last battle, right, Peter has the keys to Aslan's country. So I think that's a pretty clear one as well too that we have for us.
Yeah.
So going back to the end of this chapter, Phil, why don't you walk us through these last few scenes that we see?
For anyone who owns a dog, this scene probably hits home. I love the way that the dogs are described as behaving as whatever they are doing at the moment is immensely important. That's exactly how my dog acts. And also this just incessant sniffing of everything, which I have more respect for now that I understand they're more smell focused than visually focused. But it's just a funny scene that they keep sniffing until they start sneezing because they overdid it. But they find a young Calormene and they alert everyone of his presence. And then the group approaches them and they see that it's Imith. And Emeth is nervous at first. He doesn't know what to do. He's not sure if they're enemies.
He seems confused himself, right?
He does. And this is an interesting quote. He says, "Has not one of the poets said that a noble friend is the best gift and a noble enemy the next best?" Is that from anything, or is that
I didn't look it up.
Contained within
the
world of Narnia?
I would assume that, maybe that's from something else, but I would assume this is just part of, a quick Google here. When I search that, it only brings up lines from the last battle itself. Okay. So
it sounds similar to the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
That might be just part of that proverb, right?
Yeah. But Peter assures him that there's no need for any war between us.
Which is interesting, right? Again, I don't want to give away too much here, but they have traditionally been enemies. These have been lifelong enemies here, and yet just shake hands, let's call it a day.
Yeah. What are you going to do? It's completely dark.
Well, no, it's not dark anymore, and you see that in the picture. We're now on the other side of the door. We are somewhere else, which is very interesting. So they go through the door. The door has been closed. Narnia, we're not in Narnia. Whether or not we're in Aslan's country remains to be seen, but we are somewhere else. And we see that because in Baines' illustration, which we know are not technically, canonical, but Emeth is sitting underneath a tree, and there's beautiful grass there. You see and there's even some.
I need a different edition. I don't have any of that.
Oh, you don't have any? Here, look right here.
Your, computer.
You see here. There's even.
Oh, I do have that, but yours is in color.
Yes, I believe. Are those watercolors? Does that look like watercolors?
I'm actually not sure if these are being pulled from the original or if they were colored later.
Oh, they were colored later. Okay. Well, either way, there's a blue sky in the background. So we know that wherever this new place is, which can't be at least not the Narnia that we know, right? They're in some new place, and it doesn't look dark and decrepit.
Right, and they see each other, so.
Yes, well, obviously that too. I do want to go back to one thing, because that is the end of the chapter, and we'll just have to wait to discuss Emeth a little bit more the next time we're together. What did you think about the conversation that Jill and Peter and Lucy have together, Tyrion and Diggory as well, about whether or not they should be sad? Peter seems almost bothered. Maybe I've been reading it wrong, but he says, "Oh, Lucy, you're not crying, right?" And she's like, "Well, yeah, I am." And I think Aslan wouldn't want me to not cry. That's a double negative. But she said, "I'm sure Aslan would not," meaning I'm sure he wouldn't stop me.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about this conversation they have, where even Diggory says, "I saw it begin. I didn't think I'd see it die." And Tyrion even says, "The ladies do well to weep. It were no virtue, but great discourtesy if we did not mourn."
I read Peter's voice in a softer way in my head. So I feel like he's saying, "You're not crying, are you?"
Not like, "Oh, you're not crying,"
right? But in a gentle way to broach the topic of the fact that she is crying, and then I think he is giving her space to ask or to share more. And the first thing she says is, "Don't tell me to stop," which is, I think that reflects a real sibling interaction.
Mm-hmm. Lewis talks about some of this in both Problem of Pain and I want to say in Mere Christianity. And then it definitely comes out in The Great Divorce as well. This idea that there is a sadness that we have for those who are departed, who are not believers in Aslan or in Jesus, right? That there is a grief there. It's not a, "Ha-ha, you were wrong, told you so," right? And unfortunately, we do see that in some Christians, right? And maybe some of us, I mentioned earlier, I have a tendency to still think of myself as being more righteous than others, right? But there's this like deep sadness that, as Lewis says, and I think we probably quoted it, at some point we had to have quoted in the last few chapters about, all those who are in hell, right, chose it. Right? There's this sadness of like, I wish you'd made a different choice. Yeah. Like I wish you had, and that not just do Peter, Lucy, and Tyrion and Jill, Diggory all feel this themselves, but that Lucy, who is the closest really to Aslan, who probably knows Aslan's heart more than anyone else in the stories, says, no, Aslan would be sad too. Aslan is sad too. Like that rejection of him is something that brings him grief. It's not a, yeah, I got you. You rejected me. Like, there's hell. Keep on walking, right? There's this like deep sense of like, I really wish you would come in.
Yeah.
I'd really like you to come in.
He loves all of them.
Yeah. And then this sense of rejection of like, no, I'm going to go this way. And he's like, well, then I can't be with you, right? And I think this is often what Lewis is really trying to get at in a way that's much more easily to maybe comprehend than in some of his weightier works. This idea that it is an active choice, that this God doesn't, he will allow you, right? Aslan here will allow you to make that final decision, right? Which maybe we'll get some emails from our Calvinist friends, but this is what Lewis is saying, not us. But
Well, they're predestined. It's
They're
already,
right,
they're
yes,
already queued up. They'll
they've already
automatically
written it in their mind. You know, it's already in there somewhere deep in their head.
Speaking of that, man, I love jokes like that. Speaking of that told you so stance, I had a series of long conversations with one of my freshman year suite mates. So not someone in the room all the time, but someone who I interacted with quite a bit. And we had quite a few conversations about religion and different beliefs. And he was very, very much anti what my beliefs were. And he said that if he dies, he is going to make a request. And if he dies and it turns out heaven's real, he is going to make a request that he can see me at the front gates and shake my hand and tell me that I was right. And he was, he's mostly joking around because he doesn't think any of this is real. Mm-hmm. But I thought, that is not at all what I want.
This is not what I want. I don't want to be right. That's not what I'm in it for.
Right. I don't. It was so funny how he, like, to him, it was this grand gesture of, I would admit that I'm wrong and then shake your hand. And then, like, his plan was to then go to hell. And I just, I thought that's not at all what I want. Like, in this version of what he is thinking might happen.
Yeah.
I think that you and I have this incredible experience with the Lord, and we want everyone to have that. And this chapter just really hits home, and it kind of reignites that drive for more people to know about it.
Yeah, I think that's a great place for us to end this conversation. Oh, we've got so much to look forward to in the last two chapters. We're going to talk about Emeth and what on earth he is doing in...
Well, not earth.
What on
someplace
he is doing in someplace, wherever we are. We're going to talk about what name Father Time may or may not have. And we're going to try to figure out... All right, there's 2 chapters left. And we still have, at this point, we really don't know where we are or where we're going. And finally, Phil, in the next chapter, chapter 15, you're going to find out what further up and further in means. Because in that chapter, which is titled Further Up and Further In, my little description for you is that the 7 friends of Narnia...
Don't say it.
Travel...
Oh, my gosh.
Further in and further up. But before we go, we have a short little email from Lindsay. I think you're going to read that for us. It's about Tash.
This is one of our first morning emails.
Morning emails?
It was composed and written in the morning.
I was thinking you would...
morning.
There's the great... I'm going to do it. Whatever. There's the great season 5 of Community when they go to... spoiler alert. They go to Pierce's funeral and they come back in and they're like... I can't believe y'all said Troy and Abed are in mourning. and he was... And what is Abed's like? I said it with a U, and Troy's like, oh, like you said it with a U, like I said it. Troy and Abed are in mourning.
Nates. Gosh, I love that show.
Oh, so good.
Still holds up. This is from Lindsay. Lindsay said, we'll do last names.
That's fine.
Lindsay Somerville says, good morning. I think Lewis chose the name Tash because it does mean stone, as in, do not make idols or set up an image or a sacred stone for yourselves, and do not place a carved stone in your land to bow down before it. I am the Lord your God. Leviticus 26:1. Tash is a false god, an idol, but that doesn't mean he's not real. Call upon demons, and you'll get demons.
There you go.
What a well-said, succinct email.
A very succinct email here, but a great one. We talked about Tash oh goodness, a few chapters ago. I think it was maybe back in chapter 8. And we said that tash is Turkish for stone, but it was also Scottish for stain. And there was also this relationship to this ancient, I want to say it was a Sumerian god, I think, this god of springtime. And we talked through, okay, what's all happening here? What could this possibly be? And I don't remember what you and I said, but we probably said the opposite, because whatever Lindsay said here, which is way better than what you and I ever would have said. So yeah. I assume that we probably said, no, it probably means stain. And that's why Lindsay's reminding us that actually it makes the most sense that it's stone. And I love this, right? This idea that, no, tash isn't made of stone, but clearly could be Lewis making a connection to making idols out of stone, right? Because tash is this false idol.
I'm also glad to now have a biblical reason to not have a Himalayan sea salt crystal absorbing all the negative energy.
Is that what those things are for?
Yeah.
When I see ads for them sometimes.
That's
what people say that they're for.
Yes.
Yeah. I know. No, I knew what you meant.
It's literally plugged into the wall.
I think it's time for us to wrap up. One thing I will mention that we have coming up soon. Actually, I got to double check when this episode actually comes out, but I believe, no, never mind. I was going to say we've got C.S. Lewis reading day coming up, but
it has passed.
It has already happened by this point. So forget that I said that. And Phil, why don't you wrap up this episode? We have 2 more to go, and that's it. Not for the whole show, but for
season 7.
Season 7.
This episode is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, you too can listen to a bonus episode each month, along with other rewards. Special thanks goes to John Marr, Emily Wakefield, Ryan Smith, Ashlyn Washburn, and Ander Trophy for supporting us at our top tiers. Do you have any listener feedback? Email us at thenarniapodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 406-646-6733. You can find all of our previous episodes, links, and book information at lamppostlistener.com. We'd appreciate a review on Apple Podcasts. This helps other listeners find the show and join our read-through. Thank you for coming along on this journey. We will be back next time with Chapter 15.
See you soon.